Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last session of today's conference. My name is John Barry, and I'll be chairing this session along with my four colleagues, Ed Byrne, Áine, Ryall, Fionn, Rogan, and Niall, Dunphy. And the topic of our session is we had rethinking political economy in the last one. This one we're looking at rethinking sustainability. And for me, this is, in the way that academics do, we're kind of artificially dividing up things that actually could be linked together, because many of the issues we're going to discuss, I would imagine, in this session, we could have easily had in the last session. I mean, it's part of the necessary interdisciplinarity that I know the likes of Ed has done a lot of work on, that we need when we're looking at issues around sustainability, because it does connect to almost every part of our lives, from the law to the second law of thermodynamics, to biosystem health, and so on. And we're not going to be able to cover all of those. In a way, I felt Kieran Cohen's pain in trying to, outline the story that will replace our current story in such a short space of time. And certainly for me, I'll just kick off by saying I absolutely think that sustainability is a story. It's about challenging the myths of modernity that we've grown up with. It's about letting go of unsustainable ways of life and dreams we may have had about how life ought to be. And that's what makes it very challenging, and why we need to have everybody from, lawyers like Áine, engineers such as Ed. I don't know what I am. I'm some shape of an intellectually promiscuous social scientist, but we're going to need all of these types of knowledge to help us navigate our way through sustainability. And for me, I'll begin by saying that the pandemic has cancelled the future, but that's okay. It was a pretty crap one anyway. It was an extremely unsustainable one. It was one that was presiding over ever deepening socioeconomic inequalities, partly the rise of populism, which has been touched upon in Ian's discussion with MaREI brought this up. And so we do have a chance to build back better, as the hashtag is doing the rounds on social media. And I do think, just to, maybe begin us to provoke our thinking about rethinking sustainability, it should not be about greening neoliberalism, or as I tend to call it in Ireland, greening Leo-liberalism. It shouldn't be about simply greening business as usual. To go back to something that has been mentioned already, it's about a fundamental rethink of what are the conditions for human flourishing, which are beyond a lot of our current accepted thinking. That William had touched upon in his last session there, to go beyond not just carbon energy, but also go beyond capitalism, perhaps, just throw that out there, to actually rethink ideas of orthodox GDP as the main aim of the economy. And I do think we have to ask these fundamental questions, because it goes to the heart of what Clodagh was saying, is that if you have a very technocentric, scientific perspective on sustainability, it lends itself to top-down, non-democratic, not necessarily anti-democratic, but certainly non-democratic ways of addressing this. And ultimately, just to conclude, there's a wonderful phrase from an author that everyone should read, Mike Hume. He's a well-known UK-based climate scientist, and he has a wonderful book called Why We Disagree About Climate Science, or so Climate Change. And he asks a really powerful question, and then I'll hand it over to Ed after this. He says the issue with climate breakdown, and I call it climate breakdown, not climate change, because it's, if you call it climate change, it's like calling, an invading army unwelcome guests. Let's call it what it is. But Mike Hume says it's not what we can do for the climate, in the sense that kind of very male solutions focused approach. It's what the climate is doing for us. What is it affording us in terms of an opportunity to rethink our societies and economies and better ways of life? So, with those provocative thoughts, I'll then hand over to my colleague, Ed Byrne.
Here, John. A Fridays for Future activist recently tweeted, "COVID-19 is an emergency, but so is climate change," highlighting contrasting responses to both. Ireland became the second state in the world to declare a climate emergency in May 2019, but the response in the 14 months since has paled by comparison with that of the COVID-19 emergency. Formal Dáil recognition of a climate emergency did not result in an immediate order to cease all non-essential air travel, nor to stay within cyclable or walkable 2 to 5k distances from home, while rapidly reconfiguring city streets to favour pedestrianisation, cyclists and street diners. Nor did it require commuters to work from home where possible, or support by holiday or grow local rather than shipping from halfway around the world. Because quite frankly, such extreme and radical action would be impossible. For a start, consumers and business would not put up with it. Yet if we really believe that there is an emergency, we can do and have done all these impossible things.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Ed.
So
Áine?
yeah, so just another bit, John. Thanks. So I suppose the ESRI reported on Friday that real GDP will decrease in Ireland by between 6.8 and 13% in this year, while CO2 emissions are expected to decrease by 9.5%, and that's in line with the 7% plus per annum drop required to meet Paris Agreement commitments. So if we're to continue along this trajectory, it's clear that we'll require substantial transformational change, not least through our institutions. Each year in Davos, ahead of the World Economic Forum, they publish what it sees as the world's greatest risks. Whereas a decade ago, economic risks dominated, by 2018, environmental and societal risks prevailed. When they actually concluded, as humans internalize the economic externalities of the past 150 years, and as the risks continue to mount, the prevailing economic assumptions and operating models may no longer be appropriate for the 21st century. This is particularly shocking, coming from the global economic establishment. The emperor of neoclassical economics, it appears, may be without clothes. So the OECD and William Hines' NEEC unit have been increasingly making similar noises. The WEF's 2020 Global Risk Report identified risks around climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, environmental disasters, water and food crises as having the most impact in the decade ahead, with the infectious diseases coming in at number 10. However, in terms of likelihood, infectious diseases was actually ranked 27 out of 30 threats in this January 2020 report, demonstrating the inherent uncertainty and unknown known nature of predicting complex systems. Interestingly, the WF don't consider out of control wealth accumulation and social and economic inequality as a global risk. The reality, of course, is that firstly, each of the aforementioned risks are at or near emergency mode. As the WEF say themselves, the risks continue to mount. And secondly, each of them are inherently linked, and each are symptoms of a meta-crisis of unsustainability. It's been long flagged, for example, that zoonotic pandemic risk is escalating due to our increased encroachment on wild natural habitats. In an increasingly globalized, consumption-fueled, growth-based hyper-economy, all the aforementioned risks are mere symptoms of the same ailment, an unsustainable global construct. So the reason we don't act on these emergencies, unlike COVID-19, is that we really don't recognize them as such or want to. We're in a state of denial, willing to do just about as much as we can get away with, so long as we're not overly inconvenienced or challenged. But deep down, we know this won't cut it. We need deep foundational change in how we interact with each other and with the world around us. Early intervention is critical as well. Professor Niall Ferguson of Imperial College London suggested recently that if the UK had introduced lockdown measures just 1 week earlier, the final death toll would incredibly be at least cut by half. Delay now, regret later. And the change required is paradigmatic. In the teeth of COVID 2019, we flipped the paradigm to do impossible things in the world. However briefly, we prioritised human health and lives over the economy. Our hyper-modern society, underpinned by a neo-Cartesian quest for efficiency, separation, control and certainty, has provided great successes, but has also sown the seeds of our potential destruction. And we need to re-envisage a society, world and universe which also values system attributes such as redundancy, resilience, diversity, emergent flourishing and recognition of deep interconnection. So such a paradigm is an integrative one, embracing holistic interconnection. It integrates the best of the modern paradigm around objective measurement and control, but also embraces a clear-eyed appreciation of inherent uncertainty and process change, rejecting unique solutions as with a postmodern paradigm, while appreciating the interstitial, emergent, transcendent, numinous reality of a pre-modern paradigm whose values go beyond mere materialism. Above all, this is a transdisciplinary project, as John has mentioned. one which recognises the value and requirement of all disciplinary knowledge, as well as local and indigenous ways of knowing, in collectively and creatively seeking a contingent and hopeful path forward. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Ed, and apologies for interrupting you there. It's a pity Mary McAleese perhaps isn't still with us, because I couldn't help but thinking in your description of people saying one thing about sustainability but not really doing it. It's that famous quote from St. Augustine, make me chaste but not just yes. It's almost like make me sustainable but not just yes. And I'm going to hand over now to Áine.
Yes, thank you very much, John, and thank you, colleagues. I would like to offer some brief reflections as a lawyer with an interest in environmental governance and human rights. And it's interesting that some of my comments overlap to some extent with what Ed has said. You know, the lawyer and the engineer taking a similar view is, I think, of interest in and of itself. But to set the scene, it is important, as Ed also did, to acknowledge that the response to the pandemic, in terms of its sheer scale and its speed, shows us what governments can achieve where there is political will to act in the interests of the common good. And that's very interesting when you consider the persistent lack of ambition on climate action prior to the pandemic, notwithstanding the clear scientific evidence of the existential threat posed by climate breakdown. And I think there's quite a lot that we can learn from that in terms of moving forward towards a more sustainable future and moving quickly in that direction, which is so badly what we need to do. It's essential to generate the underlying political will, which we saw in the response to the pandemic, that underlying political will for specific government actions, and to sustain that political will over time. And that, of course, is where the challenge lies. And this will require a massive outpouring of support from the public for a sustainable recovery and communicating this message effectively to government. Because before the pandemic hit, as we all know well, governments made various commitments relating to climate and indeed environmental protection. Laws were passed, targets were set, promises were made, but time after time we have seen the persistent failure to deliver results with severe consequences for our environment and our climate. And it's clear too, unfortunately, that our existing institutions, including the courts, are not always capable of reacting with the urgency needed to address climate and biodiversity breakdown. If you take, for example, and I think it's a very relevant example, the case of nature protection, although there are many examples, but I take nature for now. Just last week, many of you will be aware that Ireland was referred to the Court of Justice of the European Union for a serious failure to designate special areas of conservation and to put necessary conservation measures in place for a very significant number of extremely precious sites. And this is a long-running breach of the Habitats Directive, nature protection law, essentially, by the Irish authorities over very many years. So I think it's interesting to see now how the pandemic has led to the public reconnecting with nature and with the natural environment, realising the value of that natural environment, the value of green spaces and of our precious marine environment. And it seems to me, therefore, that we can expect far less public tolerance of government failure to protect nature into the future. And similarly, too, I think the drop-off in traffic at the height of the lockdown exposed in a very dramatic way the impact that heavy traffic can have and does have on air quality in particular areas. And again, that brings home, I think, the consequences of air pollution, which is another area where we have seen long-term failures and failures in legal regulation to address what are incredibly serious public health issues. So it follows from all of this that one important outcome of the pandemic is what I would call this new and widespread realization among the general public of the importance of our environment and how it links directly with our health and well-being. And of course, there's a very powerful human rights dimension here too. The public has a right to information on the environment, the right to participate in environmental decision-making, and the right of access to justice where environmental law is breached. And these human rights, these environmental human rights, are particularly important now when there is a strong push to restart the economy, and that ever-present risk that environmental considerations could easily be pushed to one side in order to prioritise economic activity. So these rights equip the public to hold the government to account and to enable the public to have their say in the decisions that impact on their environment. And picking up on a theme that Mary McAleese mentioned earlier, also engaged here, of course, are children's rights and the rights of future generations, which of course cannot and must not be forgotten. So this new interest among the public in engaging with the natural environment creates, I think, a very important opportunity in terms of generating that necessary political will that I mentioned at the outset to move us towards a more sustainable future. And we need to grasp that opportunity now and take it up before it is lost. And the timing is good. We have a new government, we have a new programme for government, and there is a lot of talk right now about the first 100 days. So there is already an element of momentum building here. But we must remain alert and hold the government to account during those first 100 days and beyond. And again, the whole point here is if the political will is there and if the political will is sustained, obstacles can be overcome and government made to act. So to conclude, in an attempt to pull those rather random thoughts together, right now it seems to me that we are in what I would call a breakthrough moment, an opportunity, a rare and precious one that has been presented to us in the wake of this dreadful pandemic, and we need to grasp it and make it count, while at the same time, of course, being alert to the danger that when economies are under pressure, as they are now, there can be a very strong push to roll back on environmental protection and roll back on environmental law, and the danger of a diversion of investment away from environmental protection in the interests of short-term economic gain. And we cannot stand by and allow this to happen. And to borrow from Mary McAleese again, she mentioned the word agitators and becoming agitators. And this is what we all have to do, all of us, because the post-pandemic recovery cannot come at the price of environmental protection. Instead, we have to reimagine the future of environmental protection and indeed environmental law and our relationship with nature. Build our resilience, including our resilience to climate risks, and support a just transition, while all the time respecting human rights. Thank you.
That's great, Áine. Thank you very much. I do hope that what we will experience is a breakthrough and not a breakdown. And I'd certainly fully endorse your idea of a just as opposed to an unjust transition. And I'd hand over now to Fionn.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody. I want to offer some reflections on technology and its role in sustainability. We live in the internet age. In the past, we've had the age of steam power, the age of the automobile, the age of the nuclear era, the age of electricity and of mass production. And technology is often used as a word to define our eras, or new technologies are often used as words to describe the breakthrough of new eras. So it might surprise that the word technology has only been used in common usage by everyday people since around the 1950s. And the word itself is only 100 years older than that, so it was only first coined in the middle 19th century. When MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was first set up in the 1860s, it was a pioneer and very influential in using the word technology. So technology is something that can explain all our history, is at the root cause of all our grand challenges, and can be a solution to all our problems. That's a very new and recent historical framing, despite humankind using tools for a long time. And today, the definition of technology is even disputed by historians of technology. Some take an instrumentalist view that technology is like more a means to an end, but there's an emerging group that define technology in cultural terms. So technology embodies our values. It is an expression of our needs, and our aspirations and our prejudices and our potential. Technology today is often shorthand for computer technology, but this is something that I think reflects the power of the big tech companies to really control the conversation in ways that suit their interests, maybe not so much others. And I want to pose the question, is technology, our age, really one of an unprecedented era of technological change and innovation? My late grandmother was born in 1910 in the middle of Ireland in County Longford. By the time she was my age, in 1950, she had lived through the coming of electricity to her family home. They had replaced the pony and trap with a car. Medical developments had transformed the levels of infant and child mortality. And she had raised a family in a house with the new appliances of a fridge, radiator, a phone, and a television. During my lifetime, there have been upheavals in computer communication technology, and with that, me and my granny were able to email the Pope in 2005, which was a great breakthrough. Benedict didn't reply. We never heard anything back. Somebody who did write was President Mary McAleese, who sent a lovely warm letter in 2010 to my granny when she turned 100. So chapeau to Mary. I've told this story around my granny because a lot of stories of technology often posit technology as a force outside of society and as some autonomous thing, but technology is embedded in our lives, and how we use it reflects our values and reflects choices made by others, by us, but sometimes also by others, and so we should remember that who is making technologies. And there is a serious technology disruption today, but we should remember the disruptions that have happened in the past and not let excited conversations about the potential of technology be led by the people who are promoting a certain technology that they want us to buy. And technology has changed in the past, due to chance, and it has changed our institutions in ways that we don't always fully tell the story. So I briefly reflected on how technology changed my granny's family life, but the historian Ruth Swartz-Cohen has shown that the household appliances that came into family life in the 20th century, they shifted the burden of housework to women, and they made women busier than they were in the past. And this is because the adult men, children, and particularly domestic servants no longer did the work, and that class disappeared. They were de-skilled, and women became busier, and expectations were changed with housewives expected to take a lead. So the story of what actually happened due to technology changed, and that institution was disrupted by that. So when we tell excited stories about the potential for technology, we should reflect on how the consequences of past technology. So we can't understand technology without understanding its context, and that includes institutions as well. Some of the ways the technology of today is different, I think, is the extent of the systems. We have all digital phones in our hands now today, and they are linked in, they're in our daily lives, but they're linked up with systems that span the world. For GPS and for getting directions, that's great, but that can have there can be catastrophic unexpected impacts as well when these cascading events kind of ripple through our systems, and the Fukushima nuclear accident was an example of a number of unintended consequences that occurred due to a tight system that was bound together but had been designed for efficiency. And I would echo many of the points that are already said about designing for efficiency can create fragility. So as an engineer, you should build redundancy into a system, so you can have fails that don't take down the whole system. So technologies can have consequences, good, intended consequences and unintended consequences, but we must be careful that we don't just let the intended consequences be framed as the good ones and the unintended consequences are the bad ones. Nod to Jack Stilgo, who made that point. And we must be aware of the migration of skills away due to kind of smart technology has a de-skilling potential. The example of airline pilots who kind of use autopilot so much that they lose the ability to navigate planes when they really need to in dangerous situations. So I want to propose the idea of a technological dialogue, and I'm happy that this has resonated with previous points. So technology development should be a dialogue between needs and possibilities, and between developers and users. So it shouldn't be a one-sided dialogue that's only being had by the entrepreneurs and the technology developers who themselves are framing the discussion in terms of problems and their solutions. Autonomous cars is an example. This is a technology certainly being pushed by big tech companies, but what are the real ramifications of this technology? So we need to have a dialogue that involves everybody at the early stage of the design, not just when it's being brought in. And the last point I'd like to propose is the humble thought experiment as something that we can, as a way to imagine different technology possibilities. A few days ago, I heard on the radio a vox pop about the proposed app we would have on our phones that would location track us and that would be used then for contact tracing in the event of an outbreak. There was a vox pop done, and there was very high levels of support from the public. It would have been nice to hear, a thought experiment, other questions asked about that app. So, would you support an app that was used for private health insurance that would enable private health insurance companies to track you? That's just one alternative question, but simply posing alternative questions will enable a more fuller discussion around the full impacts of technology that could be used to reimagine sustainability. I'll wrap up there. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Fionn. Well, you heard it here first, folks. Inbuilt redundancy being used as a positive term, an essential part of resilience, and the importance, which relates to one of the questions that we can come back to in a moment, of how do we co-produce and upstream, in a way, public involvement, particularly around technological innovation. But I'd like to bring in our last, but by no means least, speaker of this session today, Niall.
John, thank you. So John mentioned earlier that the sustainability should not be about greening neoliberalism, and the title of this panel is Reimagining Sustainability. And of course, there is more than one vision of our sustainability can constitute. Very often the ideas on a sustainable future forwarded in public discourse are those which least inconvenience those with privilege, those that support the incumbent businesses and incumbent business models, and those with power. The dominant discourse on sustainability overly focuses on the need for citizens to fit in with predetermined visions of what sustainability is. However, moving towards a more sustainability future both requires and will result in substantial societal transformation. The societal buy-in and social acceptance that's going to be needed to realise this transformation can only be achieved through real citizen participation. This means the acknowledgement of citizens as legitimate stakeholders, by right as a role of citizens. It requires a meaningful involvement of citizens at all stages in decision making. This includes in defining what a sustainable society will look like. The recent enforced changes that we've all suffered to our daily lives have been a revelation to many. What was once seen as so important is now seen as far less significant. How many of us had very important monthly meetings which no longer take place. Suddenly it was okay to work from home. In fact, it was encouraged. We saw urban spaces reclaimed from the motor car. And this perhaps gave a preview of what a citizen-defined sustainable future could look like. There is now a great opportunity to engage citizens to envision their sustainable futures. We often hear about the difficulty to engage with citizens, to motivate them, to activate them. However, many governments, including many of our own recent governments, while they want to empower citizens, it's very often only the case if they agree with the government narrative. But of course, citizens do not have to and should not need to wait for an invite to become involved. Social mobilisation around environmental issues, including those that may not necessarily be in line with many of our viewpoints, are key to activating citizens and engaging them. Such movements offer a ready-made source of engaged citizens if courage could only be found to work with them and talk with them. And back to John.
That's great. Thank you, Niall. We have lots of really good questions coming in here, folks. So I'm going to, some of them are addressed perhaps to one or two more than others, but what I'd like to begin with, and it cuts across a couple of comments that people have made. What do each of you, perhaps if you could each come up with one suggestion of a practical way in which, as we come out of the pandemic and we attempt to build back better, what is the one policy practice change that you would suggest? So I'll start with Ed.
Thanks, John. We at a previous webinar in a different forum a few weeks ago, we had she was a director with Arup, a major engineering company, global engineering company, and Claude Alban was suggesting that essentially that really the key thing nowadays is intra-urban transportation. And I think, you know, we're going to be going forward in the future. A lot of us are going to be living in cities, okay, and clearly rural is clearly of great importance also. But, you know, traditionally or up to now in engineering and more broadly, the key priority was to, you know, connections between cities. Really now we need to be looking at what's called green infrastructure, connections within cities, transportation, cycling, walking, you know, public transport and so on, and then connecting that out to rural areas with, for example, park and walk, or park and ride, or whatever. So I think it's this sort of more human scale that we can actually move around. When we've flipped to a new reality, at least temporarily, whereby we're confined to smaller, our areas, our global zones are smaller, in terms of, you know, we're working from home, many of us, and so on. So we're not traveling as much. So maybe just to re-envisage how we can use our spaces, starting maybe in urban areas, and then Brent and suburban areas and villages and so on, and then moving out from there. So I think that's something that we should concentrate on.
That's great. Thank you, Ed. Áine.
Yes, thank you, John. I think as the only lawyer on the panel, I might take the liberty of referring back to a specific commitment that's given in the programme for government to deliver, apparently within the first 100 days, the long promised new climate legislation, which would be stronger, hopefully, than what's currently there, and also the promise to deliver a more beefed up Climate Action Council, which will play a very significant role in delivering legally binding carbon budgets. And the hope again is that with greater transparency, greater accountability of government, that the public will be able to see what is or what is not happening, and that we can gradually begin to move things forward in terms of accountability. And also just to mention, because I do think it's so important, the role of nature, which I mentioned in my very short contribution. There's also a clear commitment in the programme for government to review the remit, the status and the funding of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And again, there's been a lot of political discussion about that over the past number of days, but that's so important in terms of our natural heritage and biodiversity, which is key again to a sustainable future. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. Of course, it's now housed in the Department of Housing, but that may change. Fionn.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I will talk about housing, and I think something that has always been important, but even more so important now, is home efficiency and the importance of retrofitting, and combined with a few other things that have happened. So more of us are working from home, and will probably be working from home for longer over the winter. You know, if we're not traveling as much because of the remote working, you know, working from home during the summer is fine, but over the winter it'll be cold, so a lot of people could be uncomfortable. There could be energy poverty, you know, even worse than before, or higher levels of, you know, the health impacts will be there. It's likely to, you know, increase our emissions higher than they would be, which would, you know, have challenges for our carbon budget. So that's something that, you know, the one thing I would highlight has always been important, but, you know, even more so now.
That's great, thank you. Niall, just before I bring you in, another question has come in that I think is probably more relevant to your area of concern, is around a question of how communities in particular can take advantage of this current moment. So maybe if you could reflect upon that in terms of also maybe your one suggestion as to what you would propose as we build back better.
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing is that the communities should not wait to be asked to become involved. They need to mobilize. They need to engage. They need to be involved in the discussion, setting the agenda. For far too long, communities were at the end of processes asking to give consent to decisions that had already been made elsewhere, typically by people like those of us in this panel here. Whereas it's the lived experience of these people that we need to be involved in setting the agenda, in deciding what needs to be done, and even setting the problem statement. You know, we all have ideas of what the problems are for the communities, but unless you actually interrogate them themselves, it's hard to know. So I think that's the key thing. They need to mobilise.
Okay, that's great. As I just put in the chat box, educate, agitate, and organise. Probably again, we're looping back to Mary McAleese's original, presentation. I'm going to give you one more round of questions, and then we'll wrap it up. And it's a really important issue that somebody has put up, anonymous, is the issue that not enough people know about the biodiversity and planetary crisis, and what is the obligation in that context of the state to provide the education, or does it need to? Because again, I'm going to rephrase the way the person has presented it, because it's a major issue, and it's a danger in a way of a crisis framing of the planetary emergency, even that language, because is there a tension there between democratic, inclusive, citizen-based, often maybe slow forms of deliberation, and when we're facing a crisis that science is telling us? So maybe each of you to reflect upon that tension between the urgency of the crisis, and yet often, as we've seen in history, use of crisis language can mask and enable some quite anti-democratic impetus. So perhaps we start with Ed again.
Yeah, I suppose the key point here is education. Sometimes I suppose the tendency can be to go for the reductive, simple answer to a complex problem, however framed, and so on. So clearly, education is key, and I think many of us are agents, are basically agents of the government in that education process. We are educators, so it's incumbent on us in our programs, whatever level we're at, primary, secondary, tertiary, fourth level, to educate our students in the broadest context. And of course, education isn't never without values. Values are inherent in education, so we can't have a value-free engineer, despite what many may protest at times. So education, clearly, we all have a responsibility. So that's a key intervention point we can all make in having those formal education. But there's also informal education. I've been educated. I was just briefly. My 10-year-old daughter last October decided she was not going to eat any more palm oil in any product, and I've been educated a lot about palm oil and the destructive tendencies of that in the last while. So she educated me. I don't know where she picked that up from, but she obviously read some stuff or saw some stuff on TV or somewhere about orangutans, etc. So we can be educated by each other. This is peer education, not outside the formal education sphere as well. So I think, yeah, education clearly has a key role to play. The government has a role, but we're educators. We're employees of the government, so we need to fight that good fight, let's say. And also in a transdisciplinary approach. I mean, we don't all have all the answers within our own disciplines and so on, so we need to reach out at all levels.
That's great. The truth may set us free, but it's going to probably annoy us a lot before that happens. Áine.
Yes, thank you, John. I'd have to agree with everything that Ed has said. As an academic and as an educator, we have a duty to communicate accurate, objective information in an accessible format. And certainly within the universities at the higher education level, that role is incredibly important. I mean, there's been such great work done and continue to be done with the Green Schools, the Green Campus, but more and more, say, in the School of Law and in the Centre for Law and the Environment, which I direct, we pride ourselves on delivering regular events that are available free of charge, where we do our best to explain the recent developments in the law and how they fit in with biodiversity protection and the other challenges that you mentioned. And people should be able to find the links to those video recordings and other information on our website. But again, that takes resources, so it's important that government acknowledges that in order to do this well, the universities and other educators need the resources to do that too. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Áine. Fionn and then Niall.
Yeah, I honestly think I'll just echo the previous points that for me the current crisis, and you make a great point, John, that crises can often lead to retrenchment, or they can be used to further the dark forces and conservatism. But there's been in the COVID crisis, the role for experts and the transparency of analysis being used by governments to make a decision, has been encouraging. And in the research group I'm in, we found a more receptive audience to some of our contributions that are just contributions to I suppose the impact of COVID-19 on energy and emissions, but there is a greater receptivity to that, and so I think that as academics and educators, that's something that we should shoulder that responsibility to contribute. Not just speaking to each other, but speaking and engaging in a dialogue with the wider population. Thanks.
Which is a perfect segue into Niall, because this is his area of interest and research. So, Niall.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's no surprise that I would echo everything that has gone before, but one nuanced point I would make is that it's not just to educate, but it's to stimulate informed discussion. It's to allow the people themselves to deliberate on issues. So it's not educate for us as experts to tell people this is what you should think, but to enable people to explore issues themselves, and also to respect and appreciate the knowledge that they bring to the table, and particularly about the natural world and local areas and specific, maybe nature-based issues in that area.
That's great. Thank you very much, Niall. I'd like to formally bring this session to a close and thank my colleagues Ed, Áine, Fionn and Niall. Again, the topic we were looking at was rethinking sustainability, and I think one of the themes that comes out for me echoes in what Niall was saying, is that we do need to see that what we're doing, either in formal or informal education, and rethinking sustainability, it's a form of active citizenship. It's informing and empowering our citizens to be able to make choices, as opposed to then being passive recipients of something from central government, or indeed ourselves as experts and academics. And speaking of experts and academics, I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, Brian O'Gallagher.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for that wonderful session. I've been really enthused by today's deliberations, and I'm going to draw some brief conclusions, but it's by no means the final word on this. And I'm also want to thank the audience for their stimulating and provocative and thoughtful questions. And just to let you know, what we are planning to do with the questions, particularly those that weren't answered, is we will be badgering the participants to kind of gather a Q&A document that will go with the recording of this event, and that will be on our website shortly. We started out this afternoon with a question about reimagining institutions, and the first session, a very rich discussion between MaREI McAleese and Áine Hughes, touched on questions around, how can we make progress in human rights, and the need to challenge conventional wisdom and the need to argue against the strong arm were themes that were reflected through all the sessions that we had. Through a discussion on the marriage equality, the value of stories again was a theme that came out at that point, but was pervasive throughout the different discussions. As we moved on to reimagining the political economy, one reflection I thought was interesting was that the economic growth model, the dominant economic growth model, has largely stayed intact despite the opportunity that was there to rethink it after the financial crash. And that's an important reflection when we think of the opportunities that are here now in response to the COVID crash. Also in that session, we heard about the American democracy being torpedoed below the waterline. So the challenges to current economic thinking and the challenges to current democratic thinking were very prominent in that discussion. We heard about the need to rethink human exchange and around this point of how do we refute some of the big negative stories, the big negative narratives. What did come out is that this is only the first pass at this topic, because again, something that was reflected later as well is that there are stories that can be told, that need to be told, but we didn't have enough time to tell them. And so what I'd say on that one is watch this space. We then shifted to a discussion on the reimagining sustainability. Challenging the myths of modernity was something that came through, and a question around what are the conditions for human flourishing. We heard about the risks that continue to mount. We heard about the state of denial that we're in, apart from COVID. I mean, COVID did show how government can do what is required when the will is there. We also heard about the increased, during this pandemic, the increased connection people have had with nature. And juxtaposed against that, the Irish state being criticised for failure to establish special areas of conservation. So that juxtaposition between the will of the people and inaction by the state. And it was a sense that there may be less tolerance by the public going forward of the government failing to protect nature. And this may be an opportunity in terms of the ambition that's expressed in governments to do something about climate action and translating that into action. The final session focused on technology. The part of that discussion focused on technology, and there was a suggestion of a technological dialogue, bringing together the needs and the possibilities, and also the developers and the users to have a number of discussions on that. And also this requirement for the narrative, one of the narratives around sustainability, to change from the need for citizens to fit in to exploring real citizen participation. And that's another key part of this project, the DIIS project going forward. And we heard towards the end some solutions, some ideas of things that could take place, some quick wins around the focus on urban areas and how we get around the need for new climate legislation and that commitment within 100 days in the Irish context. The focus on retrofitting homes, and also a call to communities to organise, to engage. And the final piece was on education, and I'll finish with Niall's point at the end on that the need we have, and this webinar, to my mind, was an attempt at that, a need not just to educate, but to enable people to explore the issues themselves. So having these discussions and inviting questions from the audience and following up with that's a dialogue that we want to continue with, and we hope to engage you further in that journey. The last thing I want to say in closing is that just to thank particularly Aoife Dunn and Tara Reddington. They didn't speak, but they were behind the scenes enabling this to happen, and they've done Trojan work over the last number of weeks to prepare for this, and I'm very grateful. I'm also very grateful to all the speakers who've participated, in particular our esteemed guest Mary McAleese. We were riveted by that conversation, the first part of the session, but we also had other external speakers, William Hines from the OECD and Ernst from the Humanistic Management Organisation. and John Barry from Queen's across the border. And the team within MaREI involved in this will be working further on this project. We do have a web page on the MaREI website where we'll be capturing some of the blogs and papers and events as they go forward. And the last word of thanks from me for today's event goes to Ian Hughes, without whom this wouldn't have happened, and who's doing most of the legwork in making sure this project happens. So on that note, thank you very much, and this is only the first step in this discussion on this project. There's more to come. Watch this space. Thank you. Goodbye.